morning we're going to be continuing our series about TempDB, and this morning we're going to cover specifically one of the operations that impacts TempDB that I see quite frequently in looking at environments when consulting, that people sometimes don't realize, oh, this is, whether it's a default option or it's just an option, and it may or may not be useful in your situation. So TempDB is growing out of control. We have a bunch of queries that are executing, as we learned in the previous video. We see that a bunch of temp tables are used, and we start to realize that maybe some of those temp tables that we're using are really unnecessary, kind of like that one where we're selecting star into a temp table and then selecting star from the temp table. Maybe we should just select star from the table itself. And in this situation, what we're going to do, we're going to look at if we have a lot of those type of, let's say, queries where we actually need temp tables, and so of course that's fine. We want to make sure that some of the other operations that are going on while we're accessing those temp tables or while we're going to be smacking into TempDB aren't going to be draining the resources for TempDB either. So let's go ahead and look at this for just an example of something. So in this query here, what I'm doing is I'm creating a non-clustered index. And you'll see there's various options, right? I'm creating that non-clustered index on ix value and this test table. And you'll notice here that I have sort in TempDB, right? So the thing about sort in TempDB is that it's an option in creating an index, right? The problem though, which is not really a problem, it can be a good thing or a bad thing, is you just need to make sure that you have sufficient disk space in TempDB, okay? So without testing things, we have no idea what the impact of this would be. Now, I have tested sorting in TempDB, and I happen to know that in this environment, I could execute this query, and it would be perfectly fine as you see it went through. That's because in this test database, there's no other processes right now that are draining TempDB. But let's suppose that I tested this, and I realized, oh, wow, it has a huge impact, a large impact, and it chews up, again, hypothetically, about 35% of the space available to TempDB. Let's just say this is all hypothetical. But then I look at some of my other queries and they're chewing up about 70 to 80% of space available to TempDB. Do you see a problem with running this with, let's say, it takes up 35% of the space and other queries that are taking 70 to 80% of the space in TempDB? Of course, there's a huge problem, and that problem is the fact that it's going to actually drain TempDB's resources. So one of the things that we can do is we can set this to off. And what that means is then it will require disk space where this actual primary file is. So let's suppose that we had TempDB on a, let's see, there's CD, let's say F drive. So we have TempDB on an F drive, and our primary database is on, let's say, a D drive, okay? So what's going to happen is if we turn it on TempDB off, it's going to go to where our actual file group is, so that would be, in this case, D drive, instead of the F drive where TempDB is. So if TempDB's resources are already being used for other processes, then we don't want to sit there and throw more at it. Instead, we want to kind of lighten its load. So this is one of those where it depends, and it can be very useful to talk to people who can look at your environment and say, okay, this is good or this is not good. So in the previous video, of course, we looked at the impact of temp tables. Now we look at the impact of creating indexes, because a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times developers will create a temp table. So the temp table exists, and what do you think they do with the temp table? Then they create an index on the temp table, or sometimes multiple indexes on the temp table, okay? And of course, they also have other tables that they're creating indexes on as well, which they may drop later on. And so what I would suggest with some situations is to look at these various processes: the temp table creation or the variable table creation, the indexes that are being created on those temp tables or variable tables, and then look at the indexes that are being created on other tables during these same processes and try to look at that load. And the thing is that that will help you realize the amount of resources that you're putting on TempDB. Again, it's not a bad thing to sort in TempDB. That can actually be a very useful thing. In the same way, temp tables can be very useful. Understanding, though, they have an impact. All of the things that we've discussed so far has an impact on TempDB. And so if we're running out of space or we're running out of room, however we want to word it, the thing is we need to realize that some of what we're doing in our development is impacting TempDB.